This is the text that so many of us grew up with, a story we'll see somehow resembles this in some way, that explained to you as a child, to me as a child, why it is that Moses deserved the punishment that he received of not going into the land of Israel. This is the major sin of Moses' life. And as children, I don't know if anybody ever thought to themselves, why is hitting a rock so bad? Right? Why is that the reason that Moses is not allowed into the promised land? Whereas when God comes to Moses and says, you are the one that I've chosen, and Moses says, who is the next resume on the list? That's not the reason. Right? There are so many times that Moses says to God, I think with all due respect, you're wrong. Or I think you should change your ways. I think you should not destroy this people. I think you should, you think you have to feed them. I think Moses goes on, and yet this moment is the seminal moment where God says to Moses, I've had enough of you. You are being punished by not coming into the land of Israel, which Moses appeals several times between now and the end of the Torah for forgiveness and compassion and to be allowed to enter the land of Israel and to achieve the dream with the Jewish people. And God is absolutely resolute in the decision that's made in one sentence at the end of this text. This text, the source sheet that you have in front of you, looks slightly different than I usually prepare. Usually what I do is I like the English and the Hebrew to be right next to each other so you can look line against line and see what words actually mean what. But here what I wanted to do, since what I'm practicing here is a skill called intertextuality, meaning to say there's a text in the book of Numbers, in Bamidbar, that makes me think of the text from the book of Exodus, Shmot, and I want to put these two texts next to each other for you to look at. Not only do I want to put them next to each other for you to look at, I want to bold all of the phrases that are identical to show you that the structure of the two stories are exactly the same, minus the opening and the closing. So something changes in the intermittent 38 years in between the first story, where the people cry out to Moses, and Moses approaches a rock to get water out of the rock, and the second story, 38 years later, where the people complain to Moses, and Moses goes to approach a rock to get water out of a rock. So you can see all of the bolded phrases are identical, right? We'll begin in the English and we'll go from there. You can read along in the Hebrew up top, the two columns next to each other. The column on the right is from Shmot. The column on the left is from Bamidbar. Or on the bottom, it's flipped. The column on the left is from Exodus. The column on the right is from Numbers. And we'll read there. So first we'll read the story from Exodus. And the congregation of the people of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin, which is Midbar Sin, the Sinai desert, right? After their journeys according to the commandment of the Lord, encamped in Rephidim. And if you turn the page, the thesis or what they want to get to, what the Torah wants you to understand is there was no water for the people to drink. Okay, we turn to Numbers. The story opens almost identical. Then all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the desert of Zin, which is, I would bet, Sinai as well, right? Instead of Midbar Sin, somebody said Midbar Zin, and that's ultimately the way that it was held in the tradition. In the first month, and the people settled in Kadesh, right? So understand the literary usage of these places and these words, right? They go to a place called Kadesh, of sanctity, and what happens in a place of sanctity? Miriam dies. Miriam dies in a location called Kadesh. And she was buried there. We flip the page, and there was no water for the congregation to drink, and they gathered themselves together against Moses and Aaron. Now, the last few weeks of the Torah, Moses and Aaron have become professionals at putting out rebellions. Right? This has become their side business, right? So first they lead the Jewish people, and they worry about all of our ritual needs and our observances, and on their side job is seeing rebellions grow against them and figuring out ways to implore God to stand up to the rebellion and put it down. Last week, we saw Korach as the most famous example, but you have to remember I explained there is a gap of roughly 38 years between that Korach example and where we stand today. So the Jewish people hasn't had a good rebellion against Moses and Aaron in a long time. This seems like a good idea. So now we're back to the left side of the column. Does everybody see the left side? From the book of Exodus. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." Now this is from the book of Exodus. They just left Egypt. And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me?" Right? So that could be interpreted, why do you quarrel with me? Depending on how we read it. Right? Because if you read it that way, Moses is saying, your complaint is not against me, right? Your complaint is against the giver of food. Okay. Why do you tempt the Lord? Now, Moses is saying already the people are not on, you're not in good standing with God to begin with, right? Now you want to come out and revolt. And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" And Moses cried to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do to this people? They be almost ready to stone me." Okay, so Moses is fearful for his life as a leader. Now the next paragraph, and God said to Moses, "Go before the people and take with you the elders of Israel and your rod with you which you struck the river. Take in your hand and go. Behold, I will stand before you there upon the rock of Horeb." Horeb is another name that is used in the Torah for Sinai. So we're placed at the Mount of Sinai where the Torah is given. And you shall strike the rock, God tells Moses. Take the rod and strike the rock. And water shall come out of it, that the people may drink it. God says, go get the rod that we always use, you and I, that's the instrument that we use to employ miracles. Go get the rod, go to the rock that I'm going to show you, and strike it, and water will burst forth for the people to drink. And if we read the very end of the story, and Moses did so in the sight of all the elders of Israel, meaning people believed him, people saw this happen. And he called the name of the place Massah and Merivah, right? The place of back and forth and fighting. Because of the chiding of the people of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Who stands at fault in this story, in the book of Exodus? The people. We do. We do for not having faith, for not knowing what to do in a time of question. The other story opens, and the only difference in the opening is a detail that is in the book of Numbers, Miriam passes away at the outset of the story. How much time does Moses have in between Miriam passing away and the people banging down the door of his tent to say that we're starving? There's none. There's none. Could it be that the Torah is trying to lay in the reasoning itself for why Moses has an out-of-character experience, or Moses acts out of character? How many of us experience this, where we receive bad news, and then someone walks into our office, and that person seems 1,000 times more annoying suddenly, and we have such less patience with that person, they have no idea why, because they didn't hear the phone call that we just received. If we turn now into the right column, and the people quarreled with Moses. Now, mind you, this is right after Miriam passes away. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died as our brothers died before the Lord." Meaning, we are willing to die just like Korach's people died. We're willing to bring rebellion against you. "And why have you brought us up the congregation of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our cattle should die there? And why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us into this evil place?" Now here's a last dig. This is no place of seeds or of figs or of vines or of pomegranates. What are they talking about? They're talking about the spies from decades ago that came back bringing that fruit. You haven't led us to a promised land filled with pomegranates and figs and dates and milk and honey. You've led us to the desert where we'll die of thirst and starvation. And Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Meaning they just collapsed. There was no response from Moses. Moses actually hasn't spoken yet. He just goes to the place where he encounters God, and he simply falls onto the floor, he collapses. And God said to Moses, take the rod, right? Remember what we did decades ago? Take the rod and go get all the elders of Israel. And Aaron, your brother, bring him too. And speak to the rock before their eyes, and it'll give you water. Now, what is the one difference in detail between this instruction manual and the previous? He's supposed to speak. He's not supposed to hit the rock. Could it be that a person in a state of personal turmoil who has collapsed from exhaustion misses one phrase in the instructions that they're given in this instance? Is the Torah somehow making a case in its own way to explain to you why it is that Moses somehow misses these few words of instruction? And Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he had commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation before the rock, and he said to them, this is the first time Moses speaks, hear now, you rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? Are you such quarrelsome children that in my moment when I'm sitting Shiva, I have to be called out to find you water? Have you not learned anything during the 38 years of walking in circles? Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod, he struck the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron because they did not believe me to sanctify me in the eyes of the people of Israel. Therefore, you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given to them. This is the water of Merivah, the same word that's used to name the place from the first instance, from the first story. It occurred in a place that Moses called Merivah. God puts it back in Moses' face and says, you want to know where the waters of Merivah are? You have brought forth the waters of Merivah, because the fight is not between me and the people. The fight is suddenly between me and you. Now, when I was little, I heard a story from our teachers explaining why Moses didn't come into the land of Israel. Did anybody else hear stories why Moses couldn't come into the land of Israel? That Moses went and he spoke to the rock, and the rock didn't give forth water, and Moses became impatient, so he hit the rock once, and then a little bit of water came out, and then he hit the rock twice, and a lot of water came out, and Moses thought he had done the right thing, but because he didn't listen to instructions, because he didn't follow faith, he wasn't absolute in the instruction manual that he was given, he did not get to go in the land of Israel. Do you know who I think that story benefits? Teachers. I think that's a good message for teachers to give students. That's not a good message for the Jewish people and how we deal with one another. So I think that when you read this story in the text, I think the Torah sees the problematic nature in this resolution. The Torah needs to give us information to explain to the reader why it is that God would punish, why it is that Moses wouldn't follow the instruction completely. And too many times, we find one another in moments when we're not our best, and we lack the big picture, we lack the understanding of why it is that we're not at our best. I'd like to think the Torah gives us the information about Miriam's death The Torah gives us the information about Moses' collapse. The Torah gives us the information about Moses' silence through most of the story. And the Torah gives us the information about Moses' basically entire life of physicality and response to explain to us that in this moment, Moses reacted the way that Moses thought he was supposed to react. And God saw it differently. Which leads us to a whole set of questions about how God has to understand what we're going through. And yet, how can God hold us to a different level even when we know that we're not at our best? Or, I'll put it a different way, that God expects more of us even when we feel like we're not capable. In the moments when we, through Moses, as an example, feel like we're not capable of listening, like we're not capable of acting our best, like we're not capable of doing what we know is right, that's the moment when God is the only one that knows who we truly are, what Moses is actually capable of. And that's when it becomes a merivah between Moses and God. Because suddenly when Moses looks in the mirror, Moses has given up. He just wants to bring these troubled children water because they are largely incapable themselves. And God is saying, there are problems everywhere. I expect you to be the capable ones. You are the ones to stand up and listen to what I have to say, even when you encounter problems in the community. I hope and pray we use this text as an inspiration to do what's right, even when it's difficult for us, even when all we can see is problems in the community. Shabbat Shalom.